Happy Wednesday con weed, my love bugs. Another Wednesday, another book review, and also happy Hispanic, Latin, Latine. What word are we using to describe us now? This week's book will get all into that. But before we get into the book, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, engage. I'm so appreciative of all the views, of all the likes, of all the book recommendations. Trust me, I am looking through the DMs as we speak and seeing how to go about probably using my library card because I am not about to buy another book for a long time. But like I said, thank you again for all of your support, and let's get into today's book review. This week we are reviewing Finding Latina in Search of the Voices Redefining Latino Identity by Paola Ramos. For those of you who don't know, Paola is the daughter of Jorge Ramos, our beloved news correspondent who has given about 40 years of service to Univision. Paola has worked for Telemundo and Vice News Media. I have seen some of her news works and clippings. I didn't realize she had written a book until came across it at Uncle Bobby's Cafe. I came across it about a year ago, and I just felt it fitting to reopen, reread, and go through it thoroughly as I had to sit in some of my feelings. I've always disliked the term Hispanic. I always felt that it wasn't as inclusive as I think that they wanted it to be. And in reading, kind of those confirmations came to play as to what did it means to be identified in the Latino community, in the Latinx community, as well as how I came to the word Latinx as working in social services field. When I first came across the word Latinx, I came across as a non-binary. I thought it was more for the queer community, as more gender inclusive as our language, the Spanish language, is very masculine or feminine and can understand as a non-binary folk will not see themselves or feel in that place of Latino or Latina. Some other spaces or spelling of the word is Latine with the E. But for the most part, in the spaces that I've seen, it has been Latine, excuse me, with the X, as a means of being just all inclusive. So let's get into it. So in reading, I had a confirmation of why I didn't like the word Hispanic as a all-inclusive term. I always felt that, like I said before, it was very more so for like white passing Latinos, more affluent. It was this like distinction of more European colonizer blood in you, nothing that looked like me or darker, to utilize the term. So in reading, Paola writes, for decades, the term Hispanic was mainstream. It was a term coined by Mexican American staffer in the Richard Nixon administration, Grace Flores Hughes. As the term has been reported, one of the reasons Grace advocated for the term Hispanic was that it was implicitly stemmed from Hispania, the Spanish Empire. The word was able to more closely associate the community with its white European colonial past than with its Latin American roots. Confirmed. A little fun fact that she writes. Grace Flores Hughes ended up becoming a member of the National Hispanic Advisory Council for Trump. So do with that as you will. But it definitely never sat right with me as a term that I would feel inclusive for me to use. I always would identify as Latina, or if it was more so like where are my parents from, it would be Puerto Riqueña. Um, and those were more my identifying terms. And quite frankly, in reading this book, although I was born in the States, I never really identify first as American, right? Although I am, it just never felt like the right term. I would always immediately be like, oh, I'm Puerto Rican, or I'm Latina. So that really started to drive home what does Latina mean in this term as a more inclusive um role, right? Like I had stated before, I came across that term in a space that I thought that belonged to the queer community, but more and more in the work that I'm doing in the social service space, I am seeing it be more adopted. And I was actually able to sit for a data lab collection for the city of Philadelphia about a year or two ago, and they were having some issues defining the crime stats, especially within the Latina population. And there was a lot of prominent members, educators, political figures, advocates for the city. And granted, they did notice their biggest faux pas was they didn't have representation in the beginning of collecting the data. um, but they were using the word Latine, and it was this huge and rich discussion about how some folks do not see themselves within that word, how some folks who are Latino or Latine would probably be hiding out in that white population bubble and your black population bubble, because depending on how their skin color and how they see themselves is how they would identify. So they were kind of at this like juggernaut of why the Latine number stats were like so low, and we were having the conversation of it's because of the term that you're using. This term isn't as widely adopted as you think it is out of academic and other social spaces. It's definitely on a rise, but it was a really smack in the face for me as someone in this field to recognize how should this word be used. And we understand that language does evolve, but who are we saying identifies with this term? Paola notes as she quotes Dr. Guturi Hernandez, Harvard University fellow, that the use of the X in our language has not been just with the Latina word. Then during the 1960s and 70s, the X was also inserted in the spelling of the Chicano or Chicana during that Chicano movement as a way to indigenize Mexican Americans. It was used as a tool to counter Latin Americans' colonial history and ensure that indigenous people were not erased. She also states that the word started popping or being coined around 2004, and the inserting of the X was a way to express the breaks with gender binaries and welcome gender nonconforming folks into the conversation, as I has been introduced to the word, with that being part of the LGBTQ plus community. It was very interesting to note that, but this word has grown, and it's definitely throughout the work that she's done in this book shows a good way of it not being something that millennials and Gen Zers are coining, but that language evolves and that we are an all-encompassing group, and that this term kind of invites you into fold and say, hey, you who have been overlooked, this term also is for you. Throughout this book, you're going to meet a lot of people as Paola goes across the country from the west of California all the way up to upstate New York and everywhere in between to um, interview different folks, different backgrounds, different makeup of Latina community members, activists, just regular day folks, citizens. Um, that the term Latine still doesn't have a real identified definition, and that there's fluidity in that language. But also in today's political landscape, Latinos are one of the youngest demographics. And I noted as, again, as someone who's just watched the debate and just been going back and forth. 32.5 million millennials and Gen Zers across the country are one of the youngest demographic of Latino voters. Our youthfulness means we fit the perfect shopper demographic, and that according to a Nielsen report, our buying power rose from 213 billion in 1990 to 1.5 trillion in 2018. By 2023, the number is projected to increase to 1.9 trillion. As the report notes, Latina consumers represent one of the most sure bets for future growth. And this also got me thinking about the political landscape, that we are not our grandparents' generation where political pundits could put out an ad in Spanish or speak awful Spanish and say, hey, I'm aligning with you. And it's like, no, we want more. She notes in the book, today is not enough for Democratic candidates to take Latino vote for granted. They have to work hard to understand what is making the younger generation stray from the beaten paths from the Democratic Party. That's why telling the story is important, because our inability to leverage the movement thus far lies in our incapacity to verbalize the meaning of Latina, and we must learn how to do this before it's too late. That is extremely important, right? We have to define this before someone says this is what you are, because that's what we've already had. And it's not an all encompassing term. We have to stretch it for ourselves, for the community to make sense. And that also means that it could be open ended. One of the most endearing parts of the book is her explaining um, Latine to her abuelo. And Paola is also part of the queer community. So she's talking to him, she's using the term, and he goes, Pero que carajo es Latine? And she laughs and she goes, I'm Latine. And she says that it was kind of like a moment of like coming out in a way, like not that her family were like poking and prodding her to be like, hey, what's your orientation? But in that same breath, she also goes, and so are you, right? This is something that identifies as me, but it also identifies you. It doesn't shut you out of the term. And I felt that that was a really transgenerational way of saying, hey, this term is for all of us. This term is for both of us. And I really think that I enjoy that she added that in the book. This book really helped me identify better and feel much more comfortable using the term Latina as an identifier for myself, but also to give space for those who still may have not caught up and may not understand what this term means. As someone who works in social services, it's always important to utilize terminology that your clients can understand. And there's many times that I am servicing folks of the older population that will not identify as Latino, Hispanic, but they'll identify from the countries that they come from, as a means of pride and as a means of like patria and it's one thing to definitely respect and honor, or if they know you're Puerto Rican and they're Puerto Rican, instantly it's like, de qué parte tú eres, right? What part are you from? Or were you born there? Were you raised here? How did you learn the language? It's always like this sense of community that pulls you in. And I'm always proudly saying, Mami es de Ponce, Papi es de Yabucoa. You know, my mom's from Ponce, my dad's from Yabucoa, but I was raised here. And they're always like really impressed that I kept the language. And so there's this form of connection and familiarity that I feel that we're always seeking, and kind of always redefining, especially now more than ever with Gen Zers being part of a lot of folks and a lot of millennials as well, not knowing the language. I used to be a little bit of a snob of being like, you don't know Spanish, but I had to evolve and understand that not everyone had that privilege, and understanding that when folks immigrated here, there was a forced sense of assimilation. And speaking Spanish meant life or death. And a lot of folks, they couldn't hide their accents, but they can ensure that their child didn't grow up with one. And unfortunately, due to survival, we lost some aspects of culture, but that doesn't make you any less Latino or Latine, because you don't have that language indicator. Um, I think that I look back and I like cringe at those moments, but I also had to evolve and learn that I'm not perfect, and that I had a limited worldview. And once I evolved, I was able to understand and give grace to folks who didn't have the ability to speak the language, or only understand it and not be able to speak it, as other folks. And even then, there's still time when I'm a little insecure about my language when I'm around native speakers or people from the island. I try my best to be like, okay, let me think this out. Like, I really want to ensure that I'm understanding. And sometimes I do feel like I lose it a little bit because I'm speaking more English now than ever. But whenever I come home, I make sure that I'm speaking as much Spanish as I can to my mother. And if ever I have a child, I want to make sure that I pass the language on to them as much as I can. But those are all those things that I think that this book encapsulates. That Latine is that of that movement. It's a fabric of the community. It is those inside the community also welcoming those who may have not been able to have been welcomed before. You know, she touches on Afrolatismo, folks who had to flee Cuba, undocumented workers in the valley and Fresno and in Arizona. She talks to the queer folks of community. There's this young lady Carolina from Arizona that she speaks to that's on the border town. Telling their stories in such a amazing way. I give this book 4.5 stars. It was amazing. I believe she has another book. I think it's called Defectors. I definitely will be checking that out at somebody's library soon. But Paola Ramos, gracias for your contribution. I definitely love this book, and it's a 4.5 star rating. I can go on and on about the findings of this book, but I definitely would recommend you to read it, especially if you are not, even if you're not part of the Latino community or Latina community, but want to understand. She does a lot of historical references. Definitely would go recommend this book, especially during Hispanic slash Latin Latinx Heritage Month. This month, I will be reading a lot more Latina authors, some spooky stories as well, as it is spooky season. So check me out every Wednesday, Wednesday con Wilma. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, engage, and as always, read what entertains you. Gracias. See you next week, love bugs. Ciao.